Hello everyone, if you enjoy my channel, please support me with 1 like, 1 subscribe, and 1 share.
The day I hated trucks. Have you ever looked at something and felt an irrational, burning hatred for it, without really knowing why? That was me, standing in my tiny apartment parking lot in Seattle, watching my husband back his massive, gleaming pickup truck into a space that was clearly too small for it, scraping the bumper of the car next to him like it was nothing. I remember thinking, why does anyone need a vehicle that big? What are you compensating for? It was ridiculous, impractical, and completely unnecessary, or so I thought. I was a city girl through and through, born and raised in a bustling metropolis in my home country. And I had brought all my preconceptions with me when I moved to America. In my mind, pickup trucks were for construction workers, rednecks, and people who had something to prove. They were gas-guzzling monsters that destroyed the environment, took up too much space, and screamed "look at me" in the most obnoxious way possible. I would roll my eyes every time I saw one, silently judging the driver, convinced I was somehow superior because I drove a sensible, compact sedan that could fit into any parking spot. But life has a funny way of humbling you, doesn't it? It has a way of taking all your carefully constructed beliefs and smashing them into pieces, forcing you to see the world through a completely different lens. Let me back up a little and tell you how I ended up in Seattle in the first place. I met Mark, my American husband, when I was working as a graphic designer for a tech company in San Francisco. He was charming, funny, and completely different from anyone I had ever dated. He had this rugged, outdoorsy vibe that I found incredibly attractive. He loved camping, fishing, and hiking. Activities I had never really tried, but was willing to explore for him. We fell in love quickly, got married within 2 years, and moved to Seattle for his job. At first, everything was perfect. He was attentive, loving, and patient with my occasional cultural confusion. But there was one thing that always bothered me: his truck. He had bought a Ford F-150, bright red, huge, and in my opinion, completely impractical for city driving. I would complain about it constantly, how hard it was to park, how much gas it used, how it didn't fit in our garage. He would just smile and say, "You'll understand one day, babe. It's an American thing." I would roll my eyes and mutter under my breath, "It's a ridiculous thing." And that became our running joke, our little battle, the one thing we could never agree on. I thought it was just a difference in taste, a minor annoyance in an otherwise happy marriage. I had no idea that this truck, this stupid, oversized, gas-guzzling truck, would become the symbol of everything I didn't understand about American culture, and eventually, the catalyst for my biggest transformation. The more I think about it now, the more I realize that my hatred for the truck wasn't really about the truck at all. It was about fear. It was about feeling like an outsider in a country I had chosen to live in, surrounded by customs and traditions I didn't fully understand. It was about clinging to my identity, my old self, my familiar way of seeing the world, because everything else felt so uncertain. I had left behind my family, my friends, my career, my entire life, to build something new with this man. And yet, every time I saw that truck, I was reminded that I was still a foreigner, still learning, still struggling to fit in. I was so busy judging the truck that I didn't see what it really represented: freedom, independence, self-reliance, values that are at the very core of the American spirit. I didn't see that Mark wasn't trying to show off. He was trying to show me a part of himself, a part of his culture, a part of his identity. And I was rejecting it, rejecting him, without even realizing it. That rejection built a wall between us, brick by brick, mile by mile, until we were living in the same house but breathing completely different air. Until one day, he came home with a look on his face that I had never seen before, a look of defeat, of exhaustion. Of someone who had finally given up trying to make me understand. "I can't do this anymore," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I love you, but I don't think you'll ever love me for who I really am." And he packed his bags, got into his red truck, and drove away, leaving me standing in the driveway, alone, confused, and utterly devastated. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty space where the truck used to be. And I realized that I had lost him, not to another woman or to a job or to any of the usual reasons, but to my own stubborn refusal to embrace something that was fundamentally American. And now, I had to figure out how to survive in a country that still felt foreign, without the one person who had made me feel at home. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom: sometimes, it's the only place from which you can actually see the sky. And as I stood there in that empty driveway, I had no idea that the very thing I had hated most, the pickup truck, would soon become my lifeline. My husband's obsession. Picture this: a grown man, 35 years old, spending 4 hours on a Saturday polishing a vehicle like it was a priceless work of art. That was Mark. And that truck, that ridiculous red Ford F-150, was his masterpiece. I would watch him from the kitchen window, shaking my head, wondering what had happened to the charming man I married. Was this really the same person who had swept me off my feet with poetry and romantic dinners? Now he was obsessed with something I couldn't understand, couldn't relate to, couldn't even pretend to care about. Our conversations became a battlefield. "We need to save money, Mark. Why do you spend so much on gas?" I would ask, and he would sigh, that familiar look of defeat clouding his eyes. "It's not about the gas, Mia. It's about having the ability to go anywhere, do anything. You wouldn't understand." And he was right. I didn't understand. I didn't understand why he needed to go anywhere when we had everything we needed right here. I didn't understand why he craved adventure so desperately when our home was so comfortable, so safe, so predictable. I was content with my little bubble, my routine, my carefully controlled life. He was suffocating in it. And the truck was his escape. The arguments escalated slowly, like a pot of water coming to a boil. At first, they were just disagreements, minor irritations that we would laugh off. But soon, they became something darker. I started resenting the truck, not just for what it was, but for what it represented, a part of Mark I couldn't reach, couldn't understand, couldn't compete with. It was like another woman, this truck. It took him away from me, gave him freedom I couldn't provide, made him feel alive in a way our marriage no longer did. I was jealous of a vehicle. How pathetic is that? I would find myself making snide comments about his mistress in the driveway, and he would just look at me with this hollow, exhausted expression. "It's not a competition, Mia," he would say quietly. "It's just who I am. Why can't you accept that?" But I couldn't. I was so busy trying to mold him into the husband I wanted that I couldn't see the husband I already had. I was too proud, too stubborn, too convinced that my way was the right way. And every time I dismissed his passion, every time I rolled my eyes at his love for the truck, I was chipping away at the foundation of our marriage. Then came the night that changed everything. Mark had been quiet all evening, distant, lost in thought. I was doing the dishes, pretending not to notice, when he walked into the kitchen and stood behind me. I could feel his presence, heavy and sad, like a storm cloud hovering over our tiny apartment. "Mia," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I need to talk to you." I turned around, drying my hands on a towel, and my heart sank when I saw his face. He looked like a man carrying the weight of the world, like he had been holding something inside for too long and was about to explode. "I don't think we're happy," he said softly, his eyes searching mine for some sign of disagreement. "I don't think you're happy with me. And I don't think I can keep pretending anymore." I opened my mouth to argue, to defend myself, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew he was right. We had become strangers living under the same roof, sharing a life but not a connection. And the truck, the stupid, ridiculous truck, had become the symbol of everything that was wrong between us. I stood there in the kitchen, the dishes forgotten, the world spinning around me. And I realized that I was about to lose the man I loved to my own stubborn pride. Mark walked out that night, not angrily, not dramatically, just quietly, like a ghost finally deciding to move on. I heard the truck start up outside, heard the gravel crunching under its tires as it drove away, and I felt something inside me shatter. That was the night I realized that my hatred for the truck had cost me everything. And I was left alone in our apartment, surrounded by the silence, wondering how I had let my own ignorance destroy the most important thing in my life. But as I stood there in the darkness, the faint sound of the engine fading into the distance, I made a promise to myself, a promise that would change everything. I was going to learn what that truck really meant, even if it killed me. I just didn't know that lesson would come sooner than I expected, in the most terrifying way possible. The divorce that broke me. Have you ever experienced a moment so devastating that you felt like the ground beneath you had completely disappeared? That was me, standing in a courtroom in downtown Seattle, watching a judge stamp the final papers that officially ended my marriage. Mark sat on the other side of the room, his face unreadable, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. He didn't look at me. He hadn't looked at me in months. And when it was over, he stood up, nodded politely at the judge, and walked out without a word. I watched him leave, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears, and I wanted to scream. I wanted to run after him, grab his arm, and beg him to give us another chance. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in a nightmare I never saw coming. I had come to America with so much hope, so much optimism about building a life with this man. And now, I was leaving the courthouse alone, carrying a folder full of papers that proved our love had officially died. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent years resenting that truck, and now it was taking him away from me forever. He had chosen the truck. Or maybe, I had pushed him so far away that he had no choice but to leave. I still don't know which version is true. The months that followed were the darkest of my life. I had no family in America, no close friends I could rely on, and a job that barely paid enough to cover my rent. I moved into a tiny studio apartment in a neighborhood I didn't know, surrounded by strangers who didn't care about my pain. Every night, I would lie awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every argument, every eye roll, every dismissive comment I had made about his beloved truck. I replayed the moment he had walked out, the sound of that red F-150 starting up in the driveway, the gravel crunching under its tires as he drove away from our life together. I had been so blind, so arrogant, so convinced that I was right about everything. I thought I knew what was best for us. I thought I was protecting us from financial irresponsibility, from impracticality, from what I saw as a childish obsession. But I was wrong. I was so incredibly wrong. I had been fighting against a symbol of something I never bothered to understand, and in doing so, I had lost the one person who mattered most. My pride had cost me everything, my marriage, my home, my sense of identity. I was alone in a foreign country, drowning in regret, and I had no one to blame but myself. But here's the thing about hitting rock bottom, it forces you to make a choice. You can either stay there, wallowing in self-pity, or you can start climbing back up. And after months of crying myself to sleep, after countless nights of staring at the ceiling wondering how I had let my life fall apart, I made a decision. I was going to learn what that truck really meant, even if it killed me. I was going to understand American culture, not just observe it from a distance. I was going to open my mind and my heart to things I had previously dismissed. And maybe, just maybe, I would find a way to forgive myself for the mistakes I had made. It started small. I started watching YouTube videos about pickup trucks, reading forums about American automotive culture, learning the vocabulary I had always ignored. Words like torque, suspension, payload, towing capacity. Words that meant nothing to me 6 months ago but now felt like keys to unlocking a whole new world. And then, one rainy afternoon, I got a call from my ex-husband's lawyer. Mark was moving out of state and had left something for me, the truck. That red F-150 that I had hated for so many years was now mine. I sat in my tiny apartment, staring at the keys on my kitchen table, trying to process this unbelievable twist of fate. The very thing I had resented, the thing that had driven us apart, was now my only possession of value. I laughed, a bitter, hollow laugh, because the universe has a sick sense of humor. And then I cried, because I realized that learning to drive that truck might just be the first step toward understanding the man I had lost. And maybe, just maybe, understanding myself. Forced to drive a truck. Imagine being handed the keys to something you've hated for years, and being told it's now your only lifeline. That was my reality when Mark's lawyer called me that rainy afternoon. I sat in my tiny studio apartment, staring at the keys on my kitchen table, my heart racing with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The red Ford F-150 was sitting in a parking lot across town, waiting for me, its new owner. Me. The woman who had spent years complaining about its size, its gas consumption, its impracticality. The woman who had rolled her eyes every time her husband talked about its power, its capability, its freedom. Now, that truck was my only asset, my only means of transportation, and quite frankly, my only connection to the man I had lost. I laughed bitterly at the irony. The universe has a twisted sense of humor, doesn't it? It gives you exactly what you think you don't want, and forces you to figure out why you actually need it. I took a deep breath, grabbed the keys, and walked out the door, determined to face my fear. But as I approached the parking lot and saw that massive red beast gleaming in the gray Seattle drizzle, I felt my confidence evaporate like steam. It was huge. It was terrifying. And I had absolutely no idea how to drive it. Getting into that truck for the first time felt like climbing into a spaceship. The seat was so high I felt like I was sitting on top of the world. The hood stretched out in front of me like the deck of an aircraft carrier, and I had no sense of where the corners were. The steering wheel was thick and heavy, and the pedals felt like they belonged to a giant. I sat there for a good 10 minutes, just breathing, trying to calm my racing heart. I adjusted the mirrors, buckled my seatbelt, and gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity. "You can do this," I whispered to myself, my voice trembling. "It's just a car. It's just driving. You've been driving for 15 years. But it wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of everything I had failed to understand, everything I had rejected, everything I had lost. And now, I was being forced to confront it head-on, with no escape route, no alternative, no one to save me from my own stubborn ignorance. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a deep, throaty growl that vibrated through my entire body. It sounded powerful, alive, almost intimidating. I took a shaky breath, put the truck in gear, and slowly, painfully slowly, pulled out of the parking lot. That first drive was absolutely terrifying. I drove like a granny, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Creeping along at 20 miles per hour while other drivers honked and sped past me. I avoided highways, stuck to side streets, and took turns so wide I nearly clipped the curb. Every time a car came too close, I flinched. Every time I had to parallel park, I wanted to cry. I had never felt so incompetent, so out of control, so utterly humiliated. But I kept going. Day after day, I forced myself to get behind that wheel and drive. I would take the truck to the grocery store, to work, to the park, anywhere I could practice, anywhere I could slowly, painfully learn to control this beast. And gradually, something unexpected started happening. I started to feel something I had never expected to feel, respect. This truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was a tool, a machine built for purpose and capability. It could carry things, haul things, protect things. It had power that my little sedan could never dream of, and with that power came a sense of security I had never known. I started to understand why Mark had loved it so much. It wasn't about showing off or compensating for anything. It was about being prepared, being capable, being able to handle whatever life threw at you. And then, one night, that understanding would be put to the ultimate test in a way I never could have predicted. I was driving home from work on a dark, winding road when the rain started, not a gentle drizzle, but a torrential downpour that reduced visibility to nearly zero. My heart started pounding as the truck's headlights struggled to cut through the curtain of water. And then, out of nowhere, I saw it, a deer frozen in the middle of the road, its eyes glowing in the darkness, too terrified to move. I slammed on the brakes, my life flashing before my eyes, and in that split second, I understood exactly why Mark had needed that truck. First snowstorm in the truck. Have you ever found yourself in a situation so terrifying that every previous fear suddenly seemed laughably insignificant? That night, driving home from work in the pouring rain, I learned exactly what that felt like. The deer stood frozen in the middle of the road, its eyes glowing in my headlights like two tiny moons, and I had a split second to react. My instincts screamed at me to swerve, but something deeper, something I didn't even know I had took over. I gripped the wheel, slammed on the brakes, and held on. The truck shuddered, its tires skidding on the wet pavement, but somehow, miraculously, it stopped just inches from the terrified animal. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I sat there in the middle of the dark road. The deer blinked, snorted, and bounded off into the forest, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. I sat there for a long moment, gasping for air, trying to process what had just happened. And then, in the silence of that rainy night, I started laughing, a hysterical, relieved, slightly unhinged laugh that echoed through the cabin. Because I finally understood. This truck, this massive, powerful beast that I had hated for so long, had just saved my life. My little sedan would never have stopped in time. It would have slid, hydroplaned, crashed into that deer or the trees or the guardrail. But this truck, with its weight and its four-wheel drive and its sheer, unapologetic power, had kept me safe. That experience changed everything. I started to see the truck differently, not as an enemy but as a protector, a partner. A reliable companion in a world that often felt unpredictable and dangerous. I started to appreciate its capabilities, its strength, its willingness to carry whatever burden I placed on it. I started to understand what Mark had been trying to tell me all those years, that this truck wasn't about showing off, it was about being prepared. It was about having the ability to handle whatever life threw at you, whether that was a deer in the road, a heavy load of furniture, or a snowy mountain pass. And then, about a month later, the real test came. I was living in a small town outside Seattle now, having decided to leave the city behind and embrace a simpler life. The forecast had predicted a mild winter, but the weather had other plans. One evening, I looked out my window and saw the first flakes starting to fall, gentle, innocent, almost beautiful. By midnight, it was a full-blown blizzard. By morning, my little cabin was buried under 2 feet of snow. I looked out at the white, silent world, and I felt a familiar panic rising in my chest. I had to get to work. I had to get supplies. I had to survive. And then I remembered, I had a truck. I trudged through the snow to where it was parked, dug it out with a shovel I had bought specifically for this moment, and got behind the wheel. The engine started without hesitation, its deep roar cutting through the silent morning like a declaration of defiance. I put it in four-wheel drive, something I had never used before, and slowly, carefully, I pulled out onto the snow-covered road. The truck handled the snow like it was nothing, like it was born for this, built for this, designed specifically for moments like this. Other cars were stuck, spinning their wheels, sliding into ditches. But not me. I was cruising through the snow like a queen in her chariot, confident and capable, ready to face whatever the storm threw at me. And in that moment, I realized that this truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was a statement. It said, I can handle this. I can handle anything. I am strong enough, capable enough, brave enough. And for the first time in years, I believed it. I believed in myself, in my ability to survive, in my capacity to adapt and grow. The storm was still raging outside, but inside that truck, I felt a warmth and a peace that I hadn't felt since before Mark left. I wasn't just driving through a snowstorm, I was driving toward a new version of myself, a version that was brave enough to embrace the unknown. Strong enough to face the challenges, and humble enough to finally admit that I had been wrong about so many things. And as I drove through that white wonderland, the snow swirling around me like a magical dance, I knew that my journey was just beginning. Learning American culture through a truck. Have you ever learned something so profound from the most unexpected source that it completely rewired your brain? That's what happened to me when I finally stopped fighting the truck and started listening to what it had to teach me. Living in that small town outside Seattle, I was surrounded by people who drove pickup trucks, not because they were showing off, but because they needed them. My neighbor Bill, a retired farmer in his 70s, used his ancient Chevy to haul firewood, deliver vegetables to the local food bank, and help anyone in the community who needed assistance. My friend Sarah, a single mother of 3, drove her Dodge Ram to work, to school pickups, and to the hardware store where she worked part-time. These weren't wealthy people showing off expensive toys. They were hard-working Americans using the tools they needed to survive and thrive. And slowly, painfully, I started to realize that my judgment of them, my dismissal of their choices, had been rooted in ignorance and arrogance. I had been so busy comparing American culture to my own that I had failed to see it on its own terms. I had failed to understand that in this country, a pickup truck isn't just a vehicle, it's a lifeline. It's independence. It's freedom. And in a place where public transportation is scarce and distances are vast, it's often the only way to get by. The turning point came when Bill asked me to help him deliver firewood to an elderly couple who lived about 10 miles away. It was winter, the roads were icy, and his truck was having engine trouble. "You've got that beautiful Ford," he said with a warm smile. "How about you drive, and I'll ride shotgun?" I hesitated, my old fears bubbling up, but I couldn't say no to Bill. He had been so kind to me since I moved to town, bringing me fresh eggs, teaching me how to start a fire in my wood stove, introducing me to the community. So I agreed. We loaded the firewood into the truck bed, and I drove us through the winding, snow-covered roads to the couple's house. When we arrived, the old woman opened the door with tears in her eyes, thanking us profusely. Her husband had been sick, and they couldn't get out to buy wood. Without it, they would have frozen. I stood there in their small, cozy living room, watching Bill embrace them like family, and something clicked in my brain. This wasn't about trucks. This was about community. This was about people helping people. This was about the American spirit of self-reliance combined with neighborly care, a combination I had never fully appreciated because I had been too busy judging from a distance. After that day, I started volunteering with the local community group, using my truck to deliver meals to elderly residents, transport supplies to the food bank, and help neighbors move furniture. I started to see the truck not as a symbol of what I had lost, but as a tool for what I could build. I started to learn the language of the community, the English words and phrases that had once seemed foreign and confusing. Bedliner, tailgate, tow hitch, tonneau cover. Words I had dismissed as meaningless jargon suddenly became important, necessary, even beautiful. They were the vocabulary of a culture I was finally learning to embrace. And the more I learned, the more I realized that this culture wasn't about materialism or showmanship, it was about capability, readiness, and the willingness to help others. It was about being strong enough to carry your own weight and generous enough to carry someone else's. It was about understanding that freedom isn't just about doing what you want, it's about being able to do what's needed. And in that quiet moment, standing in Bill's driveway after a long day of helping others, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. I wasn't just living in America anymore, I was becoming part of it. I was learning its language, its customs, its values, not from a textbook, but from the people around me. And the truck, that beautiful red Ford that I had once hated with every fiber of my being, had become my passport to this new world. But as I stood there, feeling grateful and hopeful for the first time in months, I had no idea that a surprise was waiting for me. A letter from the last person I ever expected to hear from. The truck became my therapist. Have you ever felt so broken that you didn't think you could ever be whole again? That was me, sitting in my red Ford F-150 in the middle of nowhere, watching the sun set over the Cascade Mountains. I had driven for hours that day, no destination in mind, just needing to escape the suffocating silence of my empty cabin. After receiving that letter from Mark, a brief, cold note informing me he was getting remarried and moving to Texas, I had completely fallen apart. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming sense of failure that consumed me. My therapist had suggested I find healthy ways to process my emotions, but I couldn't afford regular sessions. So I did the only thing that made sense to me. I got in my truck and drove. And drove. And drove. I drove through the winding mountain roads, past the dense pine forests, alongside crystal-clear lakes that reflected the sky like mirrors. I drove until the city disappeared behind me, until the cell service died. Until the only sound was the steady hum of the engine and the quiet whisper of my own thoughts. And in that silence, something miraculous started to happen. I started to hear myself again. Those long drives became my therapy. Every weekend, I would pack a thermos of coffee, some sandwiches, and my journal, and I would hit the road. I drove without maps, without GPS, without any plan except to explore. I discovered hidden waterfalls, abandoned mining towns, panoramic vistas that took my breath away. I learned the names of the mountains and the rivers, the history of the towns and the people who built them. I started writing in my journal every night, pouring out all the anger, regret, and sadness I had been holding inside. I wrote about Mark, about our marriage, about all the mistakes I had made. I wrote about my childhood, my family back home, the things I missed and the things I didn't. I wrote about my fears and my hopes, my failures and my dreams. And as I wrote, I started to understand things about myself that I had never understood before. I started to see patterns in my behavior, to recognize the ways I had sabotaged my own happiness, to forgive myself for the things I couldn't change. The truck became my sanctuary, my confessional, my therapist. It was the one place where I could be completely honest with myself, without judgment, without pretense, without fear. One evening, I was parked at a scenic overlook, watching the sun dip below the horizon in a blaze of orange and pink. When I started thinking about my journey with this truck, how I had hated it, how I had fought it, how I had blamed it for everything that went wrong in my marriage. And now, here it was, saving me, healing me, taking me to places I never would have gone without it. I laughed at the irony, a bittersweet laugh that came from somewhere deep inside. I had been so wrong about so many things. I had been so arrogant in my judgments, so convinced that my perspective was the only valid one. But the truck had taught me something invaluable, that sometimes, the things we resist the most are the things we need the most. Sometimes, our greatest obstacles become our greatest teachers. And sometimes, the very thing we think is destroying us is actually saving us. I sat there in the gathering darkness, the stars beginning to twinkle overhead like a million tiny promises, and I made a decision. I was going to stop running from my pain and start embracing it. I was going to use this truck, this symbol of everything I had once hated, to explore not just the American landscape, but the landscape of my own soul. I was going to find myself in the wide open spaces, in the quiet solitude, in the simple act of moving forward. And as I started the engine and drove back toward home, I knew that my healing had truly begun. But I had no idea that the most important journey was still ahead of me, waiting just around the bend. In the form of a dusty old pickup truck and a man who would change everything. Community and connection. Have you ever discovered a whole new world of friendship and belonging in the most unexpected place? That's exactly what happened to me when I finally stopped driving alone and started letting people into my journey. It all began on a crisp autumn morning when I was driving through the mountain passes. My red Ford loaded with supplies for a community food drive I had volunteered for. The roads were winding and narrow, the trees ablaze with gold and crimson leaves, and I was feeling more content than I had in months. Then I heard it, a loud bang, followed by a terrible grinding noise from somewhere underneath the truck. My heart sank. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands trembling as I stepped out to inspect the damage. I knew nothing about trucks, absolutely nothing. I could change a tire and check the oil, but this sounded serious, expensive, catastrophic. I stood there in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but trees and mountains, feeling that familiar panic rising in my chest. I was stranded. Alone. completely helpless. And then, like an answer to a prayer I hadn't even known I was praying, I heard the rumble of another truck approaching. An old, beat-up Chevy pulled up behind me, its paint faded and its tailgate held together with baling wire. A man in his late 50s stepped out, wearing a worn flannel shirt and a warm, weathered smile. "Looks like you've got yourself some trouble," he said, his voice kind and unhurried. I explained what had happened, my words tumbling out in a nervous rush, and he just nodded and walked around to inspect the damage. "It's your alternator," he said after a moment. "Burned out. I can fix it, but I'll need to tow you to my place. I've got the parts there." I hesitated, every stranger danger instinct screaming at me to say no. But something about his eyes, his calm confidence, made me trust him. "Okay," I said quietly. "Thank you." He hooked my truck up to his, and we drove slowly through the winding roads to a small farmhouse nestled in a valley. The property was beautiful, a modest home surrounded by gardens, a barn, and what seemed like a dozen vehicles in various states of repair. As he worked on my truck, his wife brought me coffee and fresh-baked bread, and we sat in their kitchen talking for hours. They had lived in the area for 30 years, raised 4 children, and were now enjoying a quiet retirement surrounded by the community they had helped build. They knew everyone in the valley, Bill and Sarah and the elderly couple I had helped with firewood. They told me stories about the town's history, its traditions, its quirks. They told me about the annual harvest festival, the Christmas tree lighting, the summer barbecue where the whole valley came together. And as I listened, I felt something shift inside me. I wasn't just a stranger passing through anymore. I was becoming part of something. That day changed everything for me. My truck became my ticket to community, my excuse to connect, my reason to engage. I started attending the town's events, helping with the food drives, joining the volunteer fire department. I met people from all walks of life, farmers, teachers, artists, mechanics, retired veterans. Each one had a story, a struggle, a victory. Each one welcomed me with open arms, never once questioning my accent or my background or my past. They just saw me as another neighbor, another friend, another member of the community. And I realized that this was what I had been missing all along, not the glamour of the city, not the excitement of new experiences, but the simple, profound joy of belonging. The truck had given me that. It had broken down at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place, to teach me that I didn't have to do this alone. I didn't have to carry my burdens by myself. There were people all around me, ready to help, ready to connect, ready to love. I just had to be brave enough to accept it. And as I drove home that evening, my truck running perfectly again, I realized that I had found something I had been searching for my entire life. A home. Not a place, but a community. Not a building, but a feeling. And I knew that as long as I had my truck and my neighbors, I would never be truly alone again. But the biggest surprise was yet to come. Waiting for me in the most unexpected form, a dusty old pickup truck and a man who would teach me about love all over again. A new love, a new ride. Have you ever walked into a room and felt like the universe had been waiting for that exact moment to change your life forever? That's how I felt when I walked into the old barn at the county fair that autumn afternoon. My truck had been acting up again. And someone at the community potluck had mentioned that Jake, the quiet mechanic who lived on the other side of the valley, could fix anything with an engine. I found him under a rusty old Chevrolet, his boots sticking out from beneath the chassis, whistling a tune I didn't recognize. "Excuse me," I said, feeling suddenly shy. "Are you Jake?" He slid out from under the truck, wiping his hands on an oily rag, and when he looked up at me, I felt my breath catch in my throat. He was handsome in a rugged, unassuming way, with kind eyes and a warm smile that seemed to see right through me. "That's me," he said, his voice low and easy. "And you must be Mia. Bill's been telling me about you." He stood up and extended his hand, and when I shook it, I felt a jolt of something I hadn't felt in years, a spark, a connection, a possibility. Over the next few weeks, Jake became a regular presence in my life. He fixed my truck for free, refused my money, and accepted only a home-cooked meal in return. We started having dinner together every Friday, first at his place, then at mine, then alternating. We talked for hours about everything and nothing, our pasts, our regrets, our hopes for the future. He told me about his own divorce, his own mistakes, his own long journey to healing. He told me about growing up in the valley, learning to fix cars from his father, building a life from the ground up. He was patient and kind, never pushing me to open up faster than I was ready. He understood my wounds because he had his own. He understood my fear of trusting again because he had felt the same fear. And slowly, carefully, we started to build something new together. He taught me how to change the oil in my truck, how to rotate the tires, how to listen to the engine and know when something was wrong. He taught me the language of the machine, the vocabulary I had once dismissed as meaningless. Words like carburetor, transmission, spark plugs, brake pads. Words that were suddenly important, necessary, even beautiful, because they were his words, his world, his way of caring for me. Then came the day he showed me his pride and joy, a 1972 Ford F-100 he had restored from the ground up. It was beautiful, a deep forest green with chrome accents and a gleaming wooden bed. "This was my father's truck," he said softly, his hand resting on the hood like it was sacred. "He taught me everything I know. When he passed away, I promised myself I would keep it running forever." I looked at him, this quiet man with the gentle hands and the sad eyes, and I felt something shift in my chest. I understood him in a way I had never understood Mark. I understood that this truck wasn't just a vehicle, it was a legacy, a connection to the past, a way of honoring the people who had shaped him. And I realized that I had finally learned what Mark had been trying to teach me all those years ago, that love isn't about changing someone or judging their passions. It's about understanding them, accepting them, and loving them exactly as they are. I reached out and took Jake's hand, and when he looked at me, I saw tears in his eyes. "I think I'm falling in love with you," I whispered, and he pulled me into his arms and held me close. That night, as we drove through the valley in his father's truck, the stars shining overhead like 1,000 tiny witnesses, I knew that this was where I was meant to be. Not in the city, not in the past, not in the pain of what I had lost, But here, in this moment, in this place, with this man, in this truck. But our love story wasn't finished yet. There was one more surprise waiting for us, something that would bring the past and the present together in a way I never could have predicted. Trucks mean freedom. Have you ever looked back at your journey and realized that every struggle, every heartbreak, and every detour was leading you exactly where you were meant to be? That realization hit me like a thunderbolt on a warm spring morning, as I stood in my driveway watching Jake's 1972 Ford F-100 rumble to life. I had come so far from that judgmental city girl who rolled her eyes at pickup trucks, who dismissed American culture without understanding it, who let her own pride destroy her marriage. And now, here I was, standing next to a man who had taught me more about love and healing than anyone before him. Surrounded by a community that had welcomed me like family, holding the keys to my own red Ford F-150 that had become my sanctuary, my therapist, my passport to a new life. I had finally learned what Mark had been trying to tell me all those years ago, that a truck isn't just a vehicle. It's a statement of freedom. It's the ability to go anywhere, carry anything, help anyone. It's the American spirit of self-reliance wrapped in steel and rubber. And for me, it had become so much more. The surprise that had been waiting for us arrived in the form of a letter, forwarded from my old address. It was from Mark. He had heard through mutual friends that I had found happiness again, and he wanted to congratulate me, genuinely, without bitterness or regret. He wrote about his own journey, his own growth, his own realization that we had both been young and foolish and scared. He told me he was grateful for the time we had shared, for the lessons we had taught each other, for the way our pain had shaped us into better people. He even mentioned the truck, the red F-150 he had left me, and he wrote something that made me cry. I'm glad you finally understand. That truck was always my way of saying I wanted you to be free. I just didn't know how to say it back then. I read that letter 3 times, tears streaming down my face, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years of closure. The anger, the regret, the what-ifs, they all melted away, replaced by a quiet, peaceful acceptance. We had both made mistakes. We had both hurt each other. But we had both grown, both healed, both found our way to new beginnings. And that was enough. That evening, Jake took me for a drive in his father's green F-100. We wound through the mountain roads, the windows down, the warm spring air filling the cab with the scent of pine and wildflowers. We drove past the spot where I had first met Bill, past the community center where I had volunteered, past the scenic overlook where I had sat and cried and written in my journal. We stopped at a meadow high in the mountains, a place where the valley stretched out below us like a patchwork quilt of green and gold. Jake turned off the engine, and we sat in the silence, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of pink and orange and purple. I never thought I'd find this again, I said softly, my hand in his. Never thought I'd find love, find community, find myself. He squeezed my hand and smiled. You were always here, Mia, he said. You just had to stop running long enough to see it. I looked at him, this quiet, wonderful man who had seen me at my worst and loved me anyway, and I felt my heart swell with gratitude. I had been so wrong about so many things. But I was right about one thing. I had finally found my home. It wasn't a place. It was a feeling. It was freedom. It was the open road, the helping hand, the steady rumble of an engine, the wide open sky. It was everything that truck had been trying to teach me from the very beginning. So what's the lesson here? What's the point of this long, winding story about a woman who hated pickup trucks and learned to love them? It's simple. Sometimes, the things we resist the most are the things we need the most. Sometimes, our greatest obstacles become our greatest teachers. And sometimes, freedom isn't about escaping your past, it's about embracing your journey, with all its twists and turns and unexpected detours. My truck taught me that. My community taught me that. Jake taught me that. And now, I'm sharing it with you, in the hopes that you'll find your own freedom, your own healing, your own unlikely teacher. Because somewhere out there, on a dusty road or in a crowded city or in the quiet of your own heart, there's something waiting to change your life. All you have to do is stop fighting it long enough to listen. And that, my friend, is the truest kind of freedom there is.